Okay, I make it 25 past 12, and it's been a brilliant conference so far. So, a lot to live up to in this session, which I'm sure we will. It's on our place in the nation, our place in the world. And our speakers are Gareth Derrick, who's the Police and Crime Commissioner candidate for Devon, Cornwall, and the Isles of Scilly. Minette, who's the president of the National Farmers Union, who we're very pleased to welcome to the Coast&Country conference. John Healey, MP, who's our Shadow Defence Secretary now, and Daniel Zeichner, who's Shadow Minister for Food, Farming and Rural Affairs. And I'm sure we're going to have a very good debate on the way that rural areas fit into our place within the country as a whole, but also our place in the world. Rural and coastal areas produce our food, and that's very important, not just for our own areas, but for the nation as a whole. And our food standards going forward and how much food we produce here as opposed to import will affect us all. Particularly, it's going to affect our rural communities and our countryside. But it's also important that we have very good local services here, as we've been discussing. House prices have priced many people out of the jobs that we need them to do in agriculture, but also social care and childcare, but high skilled jobs as well, particularly in health. And I hope in this conference we will be able to look at addressing how inclusive our rural and coastal areas are. I must admit, with Black Lives Matters, I've been quite shocked at a lot of the comments and attitudes towards the Black Lives Matters events in High Peak in my constituency. And we need to make sure that our rural areas are welcoming and inclusive so that as a country as a whole, we can move forward together. So on that note, I will invite Gareth, who's, as I say, our Police and Crime Commissioner candidate for Devon, Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, as our first speaker in this session. Gareth.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ruth, and thanks for Coast&Country for inviting me along. Yes, I am the Police and Crime Commissioner candidate next year, but I also stood in 2016 and I have to say came remarkably close in winning. And I fought 2 general elections for South East Cornwall, so I can confidently say that I have campaigned across all of the 18 constituencies that make up this fantastic part of the country. And I remember very vividly that one of the most sort of testing and interesting hustings I took part in were those organised by the NFU for their members, obviously focused heavily on farming. But I'm going to leave aside farming, and indeed many of the other issues that have been raised already in this conference, and try and look at the title of this one, that our place in the world, our place in the nation. And I'm going to focus on 3 issues that I think are important here. They throw a challenge to our party, and also they have certainly, as far as I'm concerned, they've popped up everywhere I've been across Devon and Cornwall. And the first one I want to talk about is fishing. It has been raised, of course, but let's delve into it a little bit more. If there's one thing that unites the people across Devon, and even more so across Cornwall, it's the plight of the traditional fishing communities here in the far southwest. Whether I've been speaking to people in those communities, such as the little town of Loo, tucked away with a small fishing fleet, or to farmers or other people distant from those fishing areas, there has been a very powerful sense that fishing is a hugely important part of their heritage, but not one to be put in a museum, not one to be preserved, but one which needs to be strengthened and developed in the post-Brexit opportunity. So I would ask the question for our shadow ministers here: how will our party shape and deliver on the tremendous opportunity for these very high quality green jobs in the southwest through fishing? The second point I want to raise is about policing. And one often thinks that, why is policing an issue in Devon, Cornwall? It's the second lowest crime rate in the UK, just above Dyfed-Powys. But crimes can't be compared like for like. Statistics often distort realities. And the truth is that, just as Joy Allen raised in the very first session, there are very many difficult, deep, complex and worrying challenges related to the rural and coastal communities. And some of these are often related to that lack of connectivity with the police. Crime happens in people's homes, crime happens on people's farms and in their businesses. Now, here in the southwest, remarkably, there is a tremendous and enormous local cross-party and public support for community policing. And yet under the Tory government and under the Tory PCC that we've had here since their inception, in fact, we have never had such a low level of face-to-face policing presence in this area. PCSOs are being diminished and they're virtually at the point of extinction. They may well no longer go forward. So my second question is, what will a Labour government, a future Labour government, do to reset expectations on policing? That policing is not about just response and investigation and all that reactive work, but it's also very heavily dependent to be effective on skilled police officers working embedded in our communities, working face-to-face with our people, spotting problems and preventing crime. And the third point I want to raise in this very brief point is one that I just can't miss the opportunity of taking up, because I hope that John Healey is here on the panel. Devon and Cornwall has an incredibly valuable and important image as a delightful holiday and cream tea destination, but looks can be very deceptive. So, for example, we already have heard this morning, and we know obviously that we fare very badly in the far southwest in many measures of social and economic deprivation. But we also host a very significant range of strategic and other defence assets. And along with those come a very high numbers in the community of serving armed forces personnel, many, many veterans, and many, many of their families. So, John, I would like to ask us, what will you be able to do over the next few years to counter the belief among the many people here in the Southwest, many influential people, that we can't be trusted on defence and security? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Gareth. That's great. And you're absolutely right about police and rural crime. Minette Batters, we're delighted to welcome you from the NFU to Labour's Coast and Country conference, and to hear from the NFU, who I think from the chat, lots of people are really looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Oh, Ruth, well, can I just say what a huge privilege it is for me to be part of this panel session. 4 minutes isn't long and such a lot of ground to cover, so I'll try and crack on and get through it. So I'm president of the National Farmers Union and also farming myself in South Wiltshire, and representing 47,000 farming and growing businesses right across England and Wales. And many of you will know that recently we ran a food standards campaign that indeed is still live. And it was unprecedented, the amount of public support. So over 1 million people in under a month signed up to back our food standards campaign, which is basically saying that we want all food imports to be produced to the same standards. We don't want food that's imported into this country that would be illegal for our farmers to produce here. And this, I think, is a really fundamental point, and I'm going to come back to it, but I just want to touch on a couple of areas first, because I think what that petition showed was that this country has drawn a line in the sand. They really value our high standards of animal welfare, and they want to make sure that those rules apply to other countries in all free trade agreements. And it's why the legislation that is currently going through the House of Lords at the moment is so fundamentally important. Now, we tend to think of an agricultural bill as being slightly beyond all the rest of us. And actually, the agricultural bill will impact on every single one of us. No matter what our age is, what our community is, it will impact on all of us, because it will shape the food system for decades to come. And I would say this is the most important legislation since the Agricultural Act of 1947. It really is that fundamentally important. And there are 2 amendments that I will pick out in the interest of time that I think are important. One, monitoring and measuring our food security on an annual basis. Now, currently, this is looking at a parliamentary cycle. So it's looking at measuring food security on a 5-yearly term. We don't believe that is anywhere near good enough. It should be annual reporting. And self-sufficiency should be one of the tests that we measure the success of the journey as we monitor our departure from the European Union. The second point is the Trade and Agricultural Commission, which is currently in place, but it is only in place for a short-term period. We believe that this should be in place for the entire time that we are negotiating free trade agreements. We feel it's essential that it reports to Parliament. We feel it's essential that Parliament then debates the findings of this commission, or indeed its successor body. And ultimately, Parliament has the final say on trade deals. Now, this is about democracy as much as anything else, but it is essential that this is set down in primary legislation to be there for the journey of these free trade agreements and the discussions that surround them and the impact on the back of them. So Ruth, I will leave it there. There's such a lot to cover, but I know that you're going to be short on time and keen to open it up to questions. So that's my starter for 10 in the 4 minutes. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Minette. And yeah, we're already getting lots of supportive comments coming up, so that's brilliant. I wonder if anyone's able to share the NFU's campaign into the group chat there, just in case there's anyone who hasn't supported it yet. That would be brilliant. And I will introduce John Healey, MP, who's the Shadow Defence Secretary now. Very pleased to see you here, John. Thank you.
Ruth, thanks very much. And the conference organisers are right to try and restrict us. This is the value of this, really, is the discussion and the voices of those who are at the conference rather than on the panel. I remember Andrew Smith, who was our first Chief Secretary of the Treasury after '97, once gave me a really good piece of advice, the best piece of advice on dealing with a conference, and it's just as true online as it is in person. He said, best thing to do is stand up, make 4 points, sit down. So here are my 4 points. The first is that I'm really pleased we've got this Labour Coast and Country organisation established and going from strength to strength at this time when the Labour Party has to rebuild, and in particular from a base in which our strength at the moment is largely in cities. It couldn't be more important. And linked to that, I was involved in its predecessor organisation. Some of you on this conference will remember Rural Revival. This is the late 80s and early 90s when I was a candidate in my home area of Rydale in North Yorkshire. And what it set out to do then was to build Labour's base and to build our nationwide support. And in '97, of course, after that, we went on Labour to take more than half of what are termed rural and semi-rural seats. We took High Peak, Ruth. We took the 2 Swindon seats in Wiltshire, Minette. We took Camborne and Falmouth in Cornwall, Gareth. So it's been done before, and it could not be more important now. That's the first point. The second point is this. I now lead for Labour nationally on defence from the Shadow Cabinet. And I'd say to you, Gareth, actually my job I see almost as more political than policy. I am acutely conscious that we went into the last election and come out the other side with a greater deficit with the Conservatives on public trust for Labour on defence and security than on the economy. And for many of us in that campaign in December, the hardest doors to knock were those with stickers for Help for Heroes or British Legion in the windows. It may not win us the next election, but it will help us lose the election if we don't close that gap. And it's not always been the case for Labour, and we must do that. And I'm keen that this is part of the discussion for opening up ways of thinking about that and doing it in the future. Linked to that, defence has clearly got a major role in rural and coastal communities. Most of the major sites are either on the coast or in rural areas, not just the armed forces bases, but key defence manufacturing sites. So we don't just build ships in Rosyth or in Portsmouth and Birkenhead. We build them in Barrow for submarines. I hope we're going to be building them again in Devon at Appledore as well. We make fast jets in East Lancashire, large number of highly skilled jobs. And even some of the new technologies like the National Centre for Digital Exploitation is now located in Blaenau Gwent. So right across the UK, rural coastal locations, absolutely critical. Third point, the MOD also is responsible for holding and owning 2% of the entire UK landmass. And it's involved at the moment in a £4 billion programme over the long term, both to consolidate and to reduce the amount of land it holds. So in a lot of areas, that's creating change, and it's creating opportunities for local campaigns and local interest in the future use of that land, development, rewilding, local energy. And so from a Labour and political point of view, a really important focus for some of the things that we might want to get involved in over the next few years. And fourth point is this, really to come back to where I started. We had a dreadful defeat in December. We have fewer Labour MPs in the House of Commons now than we have since the 1930s. But for those of you on this call, at this conference, who are willing to step up and try and lead the rebuilding of Labour's reputation and profile in our rural, country and coastal areas, you should expect to be able to make demands of people like me in the Shadow Cabinet, colleagues on the front bench and the remaining Labour MPs that we have to offer you support to do just that. Because in the end, if we want to rebuild Labour as a nationwide party, we have to be able to do so again in many of our rural and semi-rural and coastal areas. And in the end, there is also no route for Labour back into government, no route for Keir Starmer into number 10 that doesn't run through many of the constituencies that you at this conference and Labour Coast and Country is looking to speak for. So thanks very much for inviting me. I'm really delighted to join you.
Thank you so much, John. Lovely to see you again. And our final speaker in this session is Daniel Zeichner, who's Shadow Minister for Food and Agriculture and Rural Areas. Daniel, good to see you again as well.
Thanks ever so much, Ruth. And could I start by thanking Healey and everyone else from Coast and Country. This has been a fantastic conference so far, and it's hugely helpful to all of the Shadow DEFRA team as we make the case for Labour in rural areas. I'm the Shadow Food and Farming Minister, and although I'm an MP for a rural seat, an urban seat in a rural area in East Anglia in Cambridge, I came to politics from a rural background, and I was elected as a rural councillor in the mid-90s in Norfolk as part of that huge surge, which I very much hope and anticipate we're going to see happening again. And I have to say, a lot of us then were part of that push to get a Labour rural conference. I actually have the agenda here in front of me back in 2002, and I think David Drew may be on the call today, and he opened that plenary conference, and I'm hoping we can build to a 20-year celebration in a couple of years' time to repeat that. I also notice on the call is Tim Mobbs, who I think was a senior officer in South Norfolk when I was a councillor there, so it's great to see him on the call. I wanted to pick up one key point that Minette Batter's made that I think is so important. There's a real huge threat to our farming and rural economies, and that is this issue of trade standards. And Labour's been absolutely clear throughout that we will not see any diminution in our environmental health and welfare standards. I mean, that's absolutely important. It's unusual for these issues to be at the centre of British politics in the way that they are now. There's a huge body of support, the 1 million people that Minette mentioned signing the petition, but alongside that, there are many Tory backbenchers who are very, very unhappy about this. And the Shadow DEFRA team have been pushing hard throughout and working with our colleagues in the House of Lords. And there will be very, very important votes in the weeks ahead. And I would just fit it into what I think is the broader thrust of Conservative policy, because I'm afraid there is a real threat to the farming economies. There's a really exciting transition to new environmentally based payments to support farming. But the initial Tory plan was really not to include food at all. Indeed, some of you will have seen the headlines from one advisor who suggested we don't really need to produce food in this country anymore. Well, absolute rubbish, total rubbish. And I fear the plan is to take a lot of farmers out, and there's some suggestion that the change to the system could see a third of our farmers leaving the industry, and there are strong incentives in the agricultural bill for family farmers to move out of the industry. My fear is that will come alongside a push to import much more of our food from the rest of the world on a cheaper basis. And that, I think, is the thrust of the Conservative policy. Now, I think rural communities, not just farmers, but the communities they are part of, don't want any of this. And that is a huge opportunity for Labour as we go forward. And I think we could have a perfect moment, really, when the Conservative government is deeply unpopular. I think there are many decent Conservatives who are not impressed by Boris Johnson and the antics of his government. If we can present ourselves as a credible, plausible alternative that wants to build an environmentally friendly, sustainable food and farming system for the future, that is our chance. So that's what the Shadow team is working on really hard. Put that alongside the planning threats, which are going to upset so many people in rural areas. We've got a real opportunity. So I suspect there'll be lots of questions, but really looking forward to working with all of you. We've had some good events with Coast&Country already. Shadow team is getting out and about around the country. We look forward to coming to a place near you soon and working and campaigning with you. Thank you, Ruth.
I'm unmuting because, as you can see, my kids at least can be seen but not heard at the moment. So apologies for their interruption. But some absolutely important points being made there, and some really good discussion points on the chat coming in. Dan Norris, you were asking how we connect with rural communities, which is interesting because actually in our now Tory areas, we are the ones with the opportunity to campaign and put pressure on those Tory MPs in order to win amendments like the one that Adam brought up is being taken by Labour in the Lords. Dan, do you want to have a question about that sort of connectivity again with rural communities?
Yes, please. Thank you, Ruth. I was the MP for a semi-rural constituency between Bristol and Bath in Somerset, and Environment Minister in the last government. And it was very clear that we had a dialogue when we were in government that resonated with rural communities. I think socialism and Labour values resonate across the country in any case. But what is the first step we need to do to reconnect? Because it is an issue of trust, and we've clearly lost trust in these communities.
Thank you. That's I will be asking the panelists to come back on those issues. We did just have a really good session talking about how we win in future in rural areas, but I think it's also, as you say, down to policy, campaigns and issues. On the subject of which then Lucy from West Somerset raised the issue of MOD land and development, and obviously it's not just MOD land, as both John and Daniel raised. Then the whole planning area that the Tories are planning to bring in will affect all our countryside rural areas in particular, because that's where we've got land to build on. Do you want to expand on that, Lucy?
Because I spend a lot of time listening to BFBS, and I've got a lot of friends who serve, and there was a very clear pattern in a lot of the bases that were scheduled for closure, which were all very strong development land. So it's like the Marine Barracks in Plymouth are, you know, they're getting rid of them because developers will love them, you know, but in some of the areas they're wanting to remove the families, all the communities, and just build more housing on them. And it's heavily disruptive to communities, and I was very worried that there's a very development issue of it, and it's mainly in rural areas.
Thank you. And from High Peak, I can certainly concur with that on the planning side. Looking at the different questions that have come in, Sonia was asking about misinformation and veterans, and Linda's just raised about the slurs that the Tories make. It was certainly a big part of their campaigning here in 2019, very negative campaigning, which once that takes a root in small rural communities is very difficult to change people's minds. Sonia, do you want to mention that about veterans in particular, but also how we deal with negative campaigning?
Yes, I would like to. Thank you. And I noticed one or two people have also flagged this up. Waveney, which I attempted to take the Tories, bearing in mind we had a Labour MP from 1997 to 2010. And UKIP were very strong here in county council elections. And what we noticed on the doorstep, which changed fundamentally, I felt, between 2017 and 19, was the viciousness of the attacks and the undermining, not only of Labour as an idea, but also myself as the candidate, sort of saying, how could I possibly be a Labour candidate? And supporting somebody who was anti-patriotic, which was another thing, linked in with fishing and heritage. And what we noticed a lot of was that people were coming out, particularly when we door-knocked veterans, they would say, I can't possibly vote for Labour because my colleagues who died, and they would mention whichever conflict they'd fought in, would be turning in their grave. You know, they had been targeted online. Facebook had targeted them individually with, I think, really vicious anti-Jeremy Corbyn as the leader, but also the Labour Party in its entirety, undoing a lot of the work which I, as a Labour councillor, had done, and other colleagues, in a positive way in particularly Lowestoft as a town. So I think that had to be refuted at a national level as well as a local level, but it played into the Brexit vote. Waveney was a 62 to leave to 38 to remain, but those Remain votes were very much in Beccles and Bungay, which have a lot of Green voters in them. So Lowestoft on its own was probably one of the highest Brexit votes in the country. And I felt as though we really had to have a strong defence of what we were trying to do. And people ignored the poverty. We've got some of the most deprived areas in England within wards, within Lowestoft. People were ignoring that purely and simply because of the Brexit issue and things on defence. So I feel that is something we've really got to get to grips with nationally.
Thank you, absolutely. And the questions are pouring in now. I've got Cornelius Olivier from Cornwall. Cornelius.
Yeah, thank you very much. And my question is perhaps because addressed to a subject that Gareth Derrick raised. We know each other. Hello, Gareth.
Hi, Cornelius.
It's on the question of fishing, right? Now, the area I represent on Cornwall Council is located next to Newlyn, which is one of the top 3 fishing ports in the country. And the fishermen, by and large, are convinced that they are just about to witness a new post-Brexit golden age. To an extent which is really difficult to sort of understand. The fish business people, the exporters, the wholesalers, the processors are much more sceptical about this, but they're quite a small number of people relative to the actual boat owners and crews. I mean, is there going to be some massive disillusionment post-Brexit for fishing communities? Are they going to find out they've been lied to, essentially, in a big way?
I think we all know the answer to that, but I will let the panelists come back on that. Thank you. And keeping with coastal areas for a minute, then Jill Cookson from Scarborough also had a question.
Yes, hello. I was just wondering whether I should have saved this for the next session, but I'll leap in here with the opportunity, because it seems to me that one of the things I'm taking out of today, it's been fascinating, is that we all have a lot in common, but we've got a lot that's very different too. And it's about how we pick up on that and how we continue to share that and understand each other's dilemmas, really. But the sort of positive to me that has come locally, I live in the North York Moors, is about this new interest in good food. And we had a bit of a panic up here when COVID first hit, because food supplies were very difficult in some of the rural areas because everybody was kind of stripping bare the urban supermarkets. And various farmers around here have actually stepped up brilliantly, and or caterers, people who are sort of in at the other end of the food industry. But I think the local experience is that we've all become much more, obviously more people in the village has come to life, and we're all getting very interested in good food, and we're probably eating better. We've probably all put stones in weight on in the last few weeks, but it's been absolutely brilliant that people are, you know, there is this interest, which obviously people across the country are seeing the same phenomenon. I've spoken to other people who've seen this. So I just wondered, first of all, how we actually managed to keep talking to each other after today and share ideas and share different experiences. I think that's really interesting. But I think there's also this big inspiration to take out of the disaster that has been COVID, and take out of it some new ideas. And there really is inspiration there for how to build a different sort of society. And I feel it very strongly. I mean, it's all quite nebulous at the moment, but I think hanging with that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And I'll turn to some farming questions now, which we've got some of. Jack, I will paraphrase in the chat. You were asking about vertical farming and what's the place for vertical farming, which we'll ask Daniel to come back on, and possibly Minette as well might have a view on that. James was asking about shooting in the uplands and if our strong stance on that will put people off. Speaking from the Peak District and somebody campaigning on that, I can certainly say there were lots more voters who were against shooting because of the impact that it has on local communities, not being able to walk dogs on the moors and that sort of thing, than were in favour of it. Liz, you were asking about how in your area you can put pressure on Neil Parish on some of the issues, the farming issues, where we desperately need to win over Tory MPs, particularly influential ones like him. Liz Hole, do you want to come in on that?
Hi there. Yeah, I just at the moment I'm organising. I've been through the general election. I've got involved in all of the different environmental groups across our vast constituency, and I'm bringing them together under a sort of strategic campaigning umbrella, so that we can speak with one voice to Neil Parish, both in person and in letters, and also sort of via the media, to hold him to account on climate issues and environmental issues, and highlight how he's voting in Parliament opposed to what he says in our village halls in Devon. So that seems like the right way to go, because he's going to have to pay attention if we bring his practice to the attention of the voters where it hurts. However, you know, we're just sort of, as volunteers, we're just sort of people living in houses doing jobs, and I'm not quite sure how to get the expertise of the party behind what we're trying to do, because it always feels like we're sort of just having to reinvent everything from scratch when we try and do things sort of slightly above our pay grade.
I think that's been a challenge for the party for quite a long time, and I must admit, as an MP, I was shocked how much we were having to invent things from scratch. But obviously, as CLPs without MPs, then trying to do that without the resources is even more challenging. So a plea to the National Party for some campaigns that we can run against Tories in our seats is an excellent one, and hopefully one that the party is starting to get on board with. We've had some really good social media adverts about the exams crisis and trying to expose what some of our Tory MPs are saying, which I hope can be used a lot more. Paul Turner from Wells, who I last saw, I think, on the fabulous demonstration through the city of Wells in the heart of Somerset, the Labour demonstration, which was brilliant a couple of years ago. You've got some questions on farming, Paul.
Yes, especially for Minette. Minette, thanks very much for coming to speak to us today. That's quite a privilege for us. You've quite wonderfully aroused tremendous public support for farming with British standards, which is Labour policy, but the government is taking away subsidies for food production and putting them into elms. And I've had a look at a couple of schemes, and they seem to have nothing to do with food, but all to do with environment, which is great in one way, but not to do with food production by our farmers. I fear a future conflict between farmers who cannot keep up British standards because they don't have the subsidy from the public in return, and the public who are increasingly aware of the standards how food is produced. And I want to keep Labour's social contract of financially supporting farmers to keep high British standards. So Minette, how is this debate on new government changes to public financial support and their political consequences for farmers' position in the community developing in the NFU and its food-producing farming members?
Thank you, Paul. I think we've got quite a lot of questions for the panel there, particularly on the agriculture side. So I'm going to ask Minette to respond if it's possible for you to come back on those points, Minette. I'll give you a good sort of 3 minutes or so because there was an awful lot in there. Thank you.
Oh, Ruth, thanks very much. Well, picking up that point of Paul's first, because I think this is absolutely critical, Paul, that we get this right. So this is a global first, effectively, to go to a system of public monies for public goods, which is primarily about investment in the environment. Now, that is incredibly important, but what we are saying is food production and the environment are intrinsically linked. You can't have an either or, so you have to have policies that are about both. Now, there is a whole multitude of things that need to happen, not least some strong and robust regulation around the supply chain, the transparency, making sure that farmers and growers get a fair return, the rollout of the GSCOP. So that is something where Labour have been great ambassadors and work very closely, but it ultimately needs to happen right now. We've said as an NFU that we want to be producing carbon neutral food by 2040. Now, this needs incentivising in order to achieve it. The law has been laid down effectively. It was one of the last things that Theresa May did, and I don't believe any Prime Minister will be able to step back from that. So I am concerned that, you know, food production is not sitting at the heart of the ELM scheme. I still think there is time to work with this government and to work with others to make sure that it sits front and centre. We need to be producing much more of our fruit and veg here, you know, things like that. You know, we need to see a more localised food system. We need to make sure that we are, wherever possible, not just in retail, but in out-of-home eating, buying British. Make sure our schools and hospitals are procuring British. That isn't happening right now. So lots of things in there that need to happen. And that picks up slightly too, Ruth, on Jill's point about COVID legacy. We've got to learn from it. We've got to build back better and get back to whole foods, raw ingredients, you know, really buying British, because not just out of loyalty, out of protectionism, because it's the best and it supports our rural economy. I could keep going, but I know you've got a lot to get through.
Of course, no, really important points there. Thank you very much, Minette. I'll ask Daniel to come back on the agriculture and rural issues as well, just to keep it to keep the focus on that for the moment, and then go on to the defence issues with John. So Daniel.
Thanks, Ruth. And could I start with the very important contribution that Dan Norris made right at the start of those questions, that issue of how Labour rebuilds trust with rural communities. And it is a huge task, exactly as John, I think, said. We've gone back a long way, unfortunately. And I think actually a lot of this starts with local government and local councils, which is why I think there's such an opportunity next year in particular. And it's so important because, exactly as I said right at the outset, I was elected back in the mid-90s. And there is a point in the electoral cycle where there are opportunities, even in areas which sometimes look completely unwinnable. My area had not had Labour councillors for years, and I was one of 3 that won that year. And when people sometimes say to me, well, how do you do it? And the answer actually is, and many people on this call will know this, it's actually about building relationships locally. Because if people trust, particularly individuals, then people will vote for you, sometimes even if they're not natural Labour voters. And what we also saw was, of course, a big Tory abstention. You don't always have to win a huge majority. Actually, if other people don't vote and your people do, then that was how I won. And I won not just once, but twice on that basis. And I think when we get rural councillors in place, building those networks, getting involved, and it can be parish councils as well. I think it's always underrated just how important parish councils can be in this. Get involved, and that I think is how we begin to rebuild those links in local communities. Jack talked about vertical farming, and not everyone will know what that means essentially, but there's a lot of new technologies coming along which will transform the way food production works. This essentially has come about partly because of technological changes with LED lighting, making it more possible. Some people may have seen on television programs, Country File and so on. Basically, under glass, much more of our fruit now is grown. People aren't scrabbling around on the floor. It's raised up. But this is particularly a lot of salad crops, which of course can be grown sometimes even underground in tunnels and things, much closer to the points at which they're being used. But it's very capital intensive, and I'm not convinced it's not going to be an immediate change the way we do things, but it certainly could free up land in the future, which comes to some of the other points that were being raised by others. Just on the whether our principal position on some of the animal welfare and shooting issues will lose the support. I've never been of that view in rural areas. We've got a principal position as a party. It's something many of us feel very strongly and passionately about. And many, many people in rural areas share that view. Now, it doesn't mean to say we disrespect others who take a different view, but I think we need to maintain firmly to our principles. I'll just finish perhaps on the point that Minette was talking about the environmental land management schemes. This may seem a bit technical to some people, but it is a huge change. We should not underestimate just how big a change it is in terms of the economic support for farmers. And I very much agree with Paul, and it goes back to my opening contribution really. I think that Labour's view is a different one. And I think, and something I meant to say in my opening comments, is we've got very good examples from Wales. Labour is in government in Wales, and there's much we can learn from our colleagues, also from our colleagues in Scotland, who are developing good policies in a lot of these areas. We don't have to reinvent everything. And if you look at the sustainable land management schemes that Wales have been pursuing, always from the very beginning taking into account food production, that seems to be a much better way to go, and I think would win broad support from the farming community too. We have a different vision for the future. It's not a rapacious global capitalist system where we destroy the environment on other sides of the world and drive standards down. We want a future which is sustainable food production and farming in this country, which respects the environment, and I believe the British people will support that.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Daniel. And I know there's so many farming issues that you have to get your head around really quickly in DEFRA. So it's really good to see our new team getting to grips with them. John, could I ask you to come back on the defence issues, on the issues with veterans, MOD land, and because of your expertise in planning, if you're able to put in some comments on the planning comments that have been made, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. I think that's one of the richest discussions and series of points I think I can remember coming up at a Labour Party event. I've just actually texted Howell Lloyd to see if he'll let me have a copy of the chat points after this event, because I think it's really useful. Can I start with Sonia from Waveney? Because really what she captured, I think, really stands for a great deal of what has been in recent years, not just under the last leader and the last couple of parliaments, but actually a longer term trend of an increasing dislocation of Labour from a number of communities, and particularly sort of more working class areas. And we reached a sense by the last election, which the Tories exploited very effectively, where we simply were not seen to share many people's concerns. We weren't seen to speak their language. We were seen to be preoccupied with the sort of, if you like, a metropolitan mindset and a sentiment which too often was seen as not proud of Britain, unpatriotic. And so the Brexit vote for me, which Sonia mentioned was 62% in Waveney, was not just a feature of coastal communities like Waveney in Suffolk or rural areas elsewhere. I represent a former coalfield and almost former steel area in South Yorkshire. Our Brexit vote was nearly 70%. And it was less about the specific issue of in or out of Europe, that the Brexit vote became the totem for a sentiment of people who felt that the system, and Labour included in that, was just simply dislocated from their interests. And so that's the bridge that we've got to rebuild. And I think we do it in part as we've done before in the 90s. It has to be a national appeal. It has to be led at a national level, which is the responsibility of people like myself in the Shadow Cabinet, and Daniel on our front bench, and obviously led by Cllr. But as far as rural and coastal areas goes, we've got to have some specific focus and be able to speak for the particular concerns that we find in areas like many of you live in and try to represent. That's the sort of broad point, and I think the Labour Together, one or two of you were involved in the Labour Together exercise, actually captured some of this challenge quite well. So that takes us on to I'm really glad that Thangham Debonair, she made a contribution to the conference earlier on, but was so struck by the quality of this debate that she stayed on for the conference. I'm really glad she has, because she, on the housing and planning side with Mike Amesbury, has started to lead a really effective challenge to the sort of planning approach that this government has. And in a sense, the 80-seat majority has given rein to that conservative instinct of stepping back and essentially giving the green light to developments and developers, which aren't necessarily doing what they should do, balancing the interests of the long term, the short term, and local residents as well. And so we're going to see more and more big developers take advantage of what increasingly are huge loopholes in any sort of planning system. And we will continue to lead the challenge, and Thangham will do this at a national level. Locally, and this brings us to Lucy's point about case-by-case developments where they come up, from my point of view, particularly former MOD sites. Within that bigger context, I think there's going to be opportunities for us to link up and try and help you give voice, a local Labour voice, to the concerns that other communities, the communities around you are going to have, to make sure where there is development, and it's often needed, it's good development, it's balanced development, it's appropriate development, and it has a broader range of interests at stake rather than the profit margins of the big companies that may be coming in. So I think there's a lot of campaigning opportunities there. Finally, if I may, Ruth, can I end where Dan Norris started us, because this is the question: how do we, particularly with a view to rural and coastal areas, rebuild some of the trust, the hearing, then the support, then the votes that we're going to need? And I think the starting point has got to be to work harder to demonstrate that we're concerned about the concerns that people locally have. Gareth, when he did his first contribution to this panel session, was totally right. In many rural areas, just like anywhere else in the country, policing, security, a sense that people are respecting the rules and they're not causing antisocial problems for their neighbours, is as important as anything else. So what we do at policing at a national level is going to be important to people right across the country. But then there are certain bridging concerns, aren't there? And I would really totally agree with Paul Turner. To you, Minette, it's a privilege to have you join us today. Thank you. And the sort of concern that you've led from the farmer's point of view, and we've led from a political and policy point of view about, say, the quality of food, is a wonderful potential sort of bridging concern. Urban, rural, metropolitan, and semi-rural and coastal areas. And I'm glad we're working very much alongside you with many of the things that Daniel's trying to do there. And then finally this, Ruth, which is the opportunity that elections bring, and Daniel made this point. For me, particularly when we're weaker at a national level, the base on which we rebuild is our local candidates and our local elected representatives from the parish upwards and beyond, if you like. So it's our council candidates and our councillors that give people a Labour voice when they may be 50 miles from any sort of elected Labour MP or more. So the May elections for our local councils, for the police and crime commissioners, and in some areas our wide area mayors, such as the wider Bristol and Western of England area, could not be more important. And it isn't just about winning those, but it's about standing, it's about reflecting local concerns, and it's about that starting to make people believe again that Labour shares the concerns that they have, is on their side, is in their community, is part of what the struggle and the concerns that they may have as well. We've done this before.
Thank you, John.
And we can do it again.
Thank you. You covered an enormous amount of ground there. Thank you. And I can see from the chat there's a lot of agreement with that. There's just Gareth that I haven't asked to round up yet. And just before that, I've been asked to ask Daniel to come back on the point about fishing, which actually links to the point on Brexit and whether how we deal with fishing in a Brexit context. So I'll give you just a couple of minutes on that, Daniel, and then ask Gareth to come back as well. Thank you.
You can ask me about fishing, Ruth, but I'm afraid I'm going to pass that one on to my esteemed colleague, Luke Pollard, who's a real expert on fishing, who's coming in the next session. Hugely important issue, but it's not what I cover, and I think time would be better spent dealing with that with Luke, who knows so much more about it. So sorry about that, but we'll come back to that.
That's quite all right. You can't be expected to be an expert in everything, and shadow ministers really do need to be absolute experts in a whole wide range of things just on their own patch. So I will finally ask Gareth to come back. You started us off, and I'm asking you to finish as well, Gareth. So thank you for your patience, and hopefully you can sum up what we've been hearing.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Yeah, it's been a very interesting and dynamic debate. And firstly, I just want to say thanks to John Healey for making absolutely crystal clear his focus on the need to address the issue of trust and security. It's so big on defence and security matters. Yeah, brilliant. And I'm looking forward to working with the Shadow team, and let's get them down to the southwest and start talking to them all, however we can do it. Thanks a lot. Just quickly touching on a couple of the other debates that have run, MOD land and development. Yes, clearly there are some big risks there. We talked about them with the horrendous potential of the planning changes that are coming through. Certainly in Plymouth City Council, I'm a councillor here, we are going to be fighting those as strongly as we can, making representations. But I want to highlight the positive side too, because sometimes it can be really good somewhere. In Plymouth, we've had developments out of a dockyard that has effectively been underutilised and undelivering for the local economy, and being able to transform certain areas into providing new economic stimulus for our city and allowing us to regenerate housing as well. So there can be some really good outcomes from the right kind of MOD land development. Misinformation for veterans, yes. I mean, obviously we've suffered terribly from it in the last few elections, last few years. All I would say was we've got a better story to put out there if we can take the time to explain it. I found that my strategy was on the doorstep was to, sometimes you're very brusquely battered away by people with the wrong views, as it were, but if you can somehow get around that, take the time to create a long conversation with them, you will actually get somewhere with it. And of course, people are very talkative, especially the defence veteran and the family community, and your message will spread far, I think. So we can challenge it, and we must do it on the doorsteps. Liz raised something, Liz Pole raised something in way back on the chatter about we've suffered from an over-normalisation of the armed forces, if you like, in our society. And that's one thing I agree with. I think we need to sort of continue to maintain this exceptionalism that they rightly have. You know, we've seen some exceptional performances by many public servants over the COVID crisis. What we must always remember is that when push comes to shove, the armed forces people are put sometimes in the most horrendous situations. They are truly exceptional, and we need to make sure that they recognise that we recognise that. I'm glad, I suppose, that I wanted to come into Cornelius's question about how we're going to take forward fishing, because he's absolutely right. There is this incredible opportunity for it to go badly wrong, and that people are going to feel very badly let down in something. So I too will now defer on my attempt to answer fishing onto the last session when Luke will make a comment, I hope.
Thank you very much. Very wise too.
I think
it is time to close the session.
Fair enough.
Sorry, Gareth. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our speakers. It has been a really wide-ranging discussion and very enjoyable, and covering a lot of ground that we haven't talked enough about in the Labour Party in the last few years. And I hope that that Minette, you can see that there's a lot of support for rural issues and for farming and the farming community. And I think someone was asking how we can get involved in campaigns that support farming and rural issues. And I know that the NFU is doing some brilliant campaigning work under you. So I hope we can certainly be partners on many of those campaigns and really put pressure on all MPs to do the right thing and support farmers and our rural communities, and that we can show through that we're reaching out to them and campaigning. So thank you very much to all our speakers, and thank you to everyone who's taken part, asking questions and in the chat. It's been fantastic. Thank you.